Okay, so we are in Acts chapter 27 for our Sunday afternoon time, and we will be starting in verse 20. In Acts chapter 27, just a very quick review. Acts chapter 27, quick review. If you remember, Paul has been heading towards Rome for quite some time now, and never under exactly good circumstances. He's been in trouble with the law since chapter 21 or 22, and he would have probably by now already been killed had the Romans not stepped in and saved him. And he appealed to Caesar, and so he's to be heading to Rome. And it's been some time coming now. It's been at this point over 2 years, probably closer to 3. And he's still not in Rome yet, but in chapter 27, they get on a ship and they're heading, to Rome, and they end up going through all kinds of problems at sea. Their particular ship that they're in, there's a storm at sea, and the sailors are sure that they're going to die. They know that their ship is going to go down and they're all going to be lost at sea. In those days, they didn't have helicopters and other ships that could hear the SOS and, show up to save you before the sharks got to you. So if you went down with your ship in those days, unless you could see land and swim there, you weren't going to make it. So this is the kind of the situation that they're in. And we pick up in verse 20 where they're in the midst of a storm, and this particular storm has really blown them around a good bit. And from last week, verse 18, it says that we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lighten the ship. And in verse 19 says, the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And we kind of stopped there last week where they're throwing everything overboard that they can. They're throwing everything off the boat that they can possibly think of to try to get some buoyancy. And so we pick up today in verse 20, and I'm going to start reading in 20 and read down through 26. And then we'll have a word of prayer. Starting in verse 20, it says, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul then stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me, howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. Father, as we continue to study through the scriptures verse by verse, help us to focus upon the word of God. Help us to learn what we need to be learning, Lord, and applying it to ourselves. What we're reading here has a lot to do with just sailing and the storm and all of that. But as we seek to make spiritual application to our life, we ask, dear God, that you would teach us by your Spirit, encourage us. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So verse 20, starting in verse 20, it says there, when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared. That doesn't mean that the moon did. The moon didn't either. And no small tempest lay on us. All hope that we should be saved was then taken away. I read this and I read the phrase in many days. And I try to put myself in that situation that they're in. They're in they're in a ship that they know they're going to be shipwrecked. And they're so busy fighting against the storm and so forth that they don't really mark exactly how many days. They just say in many days. It's a number of days. It's not just a few days. It's not 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. It's many days. And in many days, they don't even know how many. But the point is that this is no small storm. This is a big deal. It's not a small struggle. They're really fighting against the sea, but they haven't seen the sun. They haven't seen the stars. And of course, that's because of the cloud cover, the cloud and the winds and the waves and the rain and all of that's going on for many days. And, what that means is that this is a huge, huge storm. And at this point, The storm is huge, and their thinking is that we're all going to die. They're basically just waiting around to die. That's what they're doing. And by all appearances, this is what they've kind of resigned themselves to this fate, and they're fighting against the storm, not because they think that there's any hope, but just to prolong what they see to be the inevitable, that they're going to be destroyed. So they're caught up in the middle of this. And I try to imagine what it would be like to be in a situation like that, because these are not just guys out on a sailing boat in the middle of the local lake. These are seamen. They've been doing this, a long time. They're good at this. This is their life. This is what they know. And they know that there's no hope. This is what they know. And so I can imagine what they're feeling. And the passage says, that all hope that we should be saved was then taken away after many days. So for a while, they're like, yeah, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can save ourselves. But then after struggling for so long, they come to the point that, no, we can't save ourselves. All we can do is prolong, what is going to come. I'd rather die on Saturday than die on Thursday. So let's keep working and see, how long we can last. And so along with this, they're also doing some fasting, and we'll learn about that in the next verse. But every human attempt that they could possibly take in order to save themselves has been exhausted, and it's all failed. Up to this point, there is nothing less. So, now they're even fasting. And remember, we're not talking about Christians here. Paul and his team, they're Christians, but other than that, everybody else, they've got their idols or their false gods or whatever they may be. But according to verse 21, there had been a long abstinence. In other words, they had not eaten for a while. So what are they doing? They're turning to their gods. They've done everything they can, and it's all failed. So now they're turning to their gods, seeking some sort of supernatural intervention for this, huge storm that's about to claim their life. So in verse 21, it says, but after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. A long abstinence. Fasting. I have fasted in my life. I think the longest fast that I ever did, I think I did 3 days fast once. There was a 10-day window where I did nothing but fruit smoothies, without the sugar and all the extra sweet stuff added. It was just fruit, Lost 10 pounds in 10 days. That's a good way to do it. Some people say, well, you must have felt awful weak and sickly. Actually, I felt pretty good. But I just love steak. I love my meat. So that wasn't going to be a long-term thing. But I can't imagine what these guys are going through here. They're serious. Remember, in these days, it's not like we've got electric motor boats, boom, 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 and you're just trying to. No, this took a lot of pulling of ropes and oars and that sort of thing, and moving the sails. So this is a very physical job. And now they've gone long abstinence. They're weak. They're discouraged. They're beaten. You can just imagine that these men are just beaten. And then Paul steps forward with his great words of encouragement. I told you so, which is probably not the exact, tone that he had, but, it's a bad situation. Any unsaved man who has come to this point to where he's also fasting and that sort of thing in order to try to get some relief, and yet he's crying out to false gods and he can't get any relief from that, that's a pitiful sight. And so add to this the fact that Paul now comes forward with a gentle, it's really a gentle rebuke for, not heeding his warning when they lose from Crete. So remember, when they lose from Crete, they said, oh, there's a soft wind blowing. This is going to be good. Now's the time. There's no storm here. Let's move on. But they can't move on. As soon as they release and they go out, the soft wind turns into a big, horrible storm, and they realize that they've made a big mistake. And so Paul's words ring out loud and clear. You should have listened. I told you so. Sometimes what we need is not what they were doing was religious activity, that whole abstinence fasting thing. What we need is not religious activity like fasting or sometimes even prayer. And that may sound funny, but sometimes we don't need to pray. We just need to obey. When God has laid out in his word what we need to do or made it clear what we need to do, and I've been in, in my time as a pastor, there have been times when I knew that God wanted the church to do something, and I would approach the men. I'd pull the men aside, and I'd say, "Men, I think God would have us to do this." And there's always that one who goes, "Well, I think we just need to pray more," which is their way of saying, "I really don't want to do this, but I can't give you a good reason why. So I'm going to throw this out there and kind of delay things a little bit." Sometimes we just need to do it. And when you know that God has spoken, he doesn't need you to pray and get his will. You've already got it. You just do it. And so this was not a good time for them to be fasting. And prayer, of course, is always, the Bible says pray without ceasing. But obedience was what they really needed. But they'd kind of blown right by that. Paul said, "Don't loose from Crete. Let's stay here. It's safer here. Don't do this." What do you know? You're a preacher. We're sailors. We're moving on. And they didn't listen. He warned them. But since they did not heed the warning of the man of God, now they're in danger. They thought they knew better, and they didn't. And I got to tell you, I have seen this again a million times. Well, I'm probably exaggerating a little bit. 50 times over, okay? I've seen it quite a lot where somebody always thinks that they know better than their leadership. And, you can put that in a secular realm if you want to, but I'm speaking spiritual leadership mostly. Maybe your parents or your pastors or something of that nature. And they always think they know better. And only to find out later that, my way of thinking or my road got me in trouble. One of my favorite Christian movies is a movie called Time Changer. And it's about a young guy who writes a book, and he wants the college that he's involved in to help him promote the book, to basically put their stamp of approval on it. And there's a man that works at this college. It's a Christian college. It's a book on theology, who takes issue with the book because he's teaching morality minus Jesus, basically a social gospel approach. And, he says, "No, you don't understand where this can lead." And he said, "How's it a bad thing to get people to be good? If they're not going to be saved, at least they can be good." And that was kind of the approach. And he said, "You don't understand." So he puts him in a time machine so he could go forward in time and see the mess that kind of theology leads to. And the guy goes back and he goes, "You were right, you were right, you were right." Now that I've ruined the movie for everybody in the world, the reality is there's a good lesson in that sometimes we think we know when we don't. And here's a good example of this. They were not listening to the man of God. Why should they? He's not a sailor. What does he know? What experience does he have? Well, he'd been, shipwrecked 3 times, a night and day out in the deep. He had some experience. He had something to go back on here. So they probably should have listened, but they didn't. And now they find themselves in big trouble. So what does he do? What's his attitude? Does Paul come across and say, "You big bunch of blithering idiots. I told you didn't listen. Now look what's going to happen. You already threw my suitcases in the water. What else am I going to have to lose because you wouldn't listen?" Instead, he just comes forward with a single, really not very strong rebuke, followed by, as we're going to see in the next verse, words of comfort and encouragement. So in verse 22, he says, "And now I exhort you, be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship." So at this point, they've been battling the storm for many days. You can look back at verses 17 through 20 and see many days. They're expecting to die. And then Paul comes along and says, "See, I told you so." There's never a good time to say, "I told you so," but he does. And, by now I'm sure they're ready to listen. Okay, you got our attention, And so it's at this point that Paul now does what most people don't do. Usually when we're right and somebody else is wrong and what they've done has caused us great harm or great hardship, we make sure to drive the point home. Because you didn't listen to me, now we've got this going on. And it's not usually the way Paul handled it, but Paul handles it in a different way. It gives them some encouragement. But the encouragement is not just simple ear tickling. He doesn't come forward and say, "All right, so you messed up, but it's going to be all okay. It's going to be all right. Bless, 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 health and wealth. It's all going to be okay." No, he doesn't do that. Instead, he says, "You didn't listen to me, but it's all right. We're going to lose a ship, but that's okay." So he doesn't candy coat the truth. He just says, this is going to happen. This is going to come a result as a step from your disobedience. That's going to happen, but the reality is it's not all lost. So it's not ear tickling, it's the truth. It's coupled with what we like to call reality. And the whole ship is going to be lost, but we're going to be saved. And that's what Paul tells them. So in verse 23, it says, "For there stood by me this night an angel of God." So now Paul begins to explain how he knows this. He doesn't just, want to give them a warm fuzzy and make them feel good. He's telling them he knows this because an angel of the Lord came to him, and he says, "For there stood me this night, by me this night, the angel of God, whom I am and whom I serve." So this is not a specific angel. He doesn't say, Gabriel came to me or Michael came to me. He doesn't give a name, but it's just simply an angel. But under the circumstances, just the appearance of an angel like this or one of God's messengers was probably comforting. It would be to me when I'm sitting there in the bottom of the ship going, I'm probably going to die because these sailors didn't listen to me. Can you imagine being Paul? I know I'm right, but they're not listening. And I don't like sharks. This is going to be bad. But he doesn't take that route. Instead, he gives them the encouragement and he tells them how he knows. He says, an angel spoke to me last night, and the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. So I like what Paul says here about his relationship to God. He says that he belongs to God. I belong to him and I serve him. So he doesn't claim any right to his own life because he's about to die, but he has no right to his own life because he says, I serve God, I belong to God. One of the things that's helpful, and which has helped me in the past, and I know that there's been millions or billions of saints before me that have been helped in this way. But when you're really, really going through something, and you just really, who has not been to the point of being upset about something or depressed about something? Everybody has that. Discouragement, the number one enemy in a pastor's life. You often hear the number one enemy is either money or women or whatever, but it's not. I think the number one enemy is discouragement. I face that a whole lot more than anything else. Usually it's on Mondays when I wake up and realize that nothing changed. Even though I preached my heart out on Sunday, they should have listened to me, but I'm in the bottom of the ship and it's going to go down and yada, yada, yada. And you get discouraged. But Paul says, but I belong to God. So whatever happens, he it meets his approval. It's what he wants. So, this is something that he has come to, which has, he doesn't claim any right to himself. He just simply saw himself as being a servant in the middle of God's will, doing what, God's will is, because he has absolutely no control. Verse 24, he gives us the message from the angel saying, "Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee." So the angel tells him, fear not. And he calls him Paul. It's kind of nice to know that the Lord knows my name. When I pray and I call upon him, he doesn't go, what's your name again? Bob. No, Bill. Don't tell me. I'll get it in a minute. That's not my God. We have a personal relationship, and he knows me personally, and he knows my name. And he knows my future. Just like this angel says, thou must be brought before Caesar. Obviously, you can't die in a shipwreck if you're going to be brought before Caesar. And then he says, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So this is the encouraging message that Paul receives first from the angel. And now he's delivering it to the sailors. And he relates it to them. And his relation is, first, Paul would make it to stand before Caesar. But secondly, and this is the part that would be most meaningful to the sailors, and that was that the ship was it's not that the ship is going to make it, but everybody else is going to make it through the storm. They're going to lose the ship, but everyone will live. And so he shares that with him. The idea is not that, when the verse that says, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. And so it's not the idea that they were all going to become believers. I've no doubt that, some of them probably did, but that's not that. It's just the implication that God was going to spare their life. When I thought about this and I read this, I thought about Paul's situation. And, what is happening here? Because of God's will for Paul's life, these unbelievers are blessed. Because of God's will in Paul's life, these unbelievers are spared. And I wonder sometimes how many unbelievers have been blessed or protected for the sake of a believer. I've vivid imagination. So imagine being on a train or an airplane or something with 100 other people, and they're all lost, and the train is going to wreck or hit an animal or something. Some bad thing is going to happen, but nothing happens because you're on the train and God's protecting you. And in order to protect you, he protects everybody else at the same time. We'll never know. We could never know the side of heaven about how, the Lord works in that way. So in verse 25, he says, "Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me." What started in verse 21 as a gentle rebuke ends with a strong message of confidence. One thing that you learn in either leadership courses or, even often by experience, and especially when you're raising kids, that, we like to use a sandwich approach, just like in Second Timothy chapter 3, we're talking about the scriptures that's profitable for doctrine, that's a plus. For reproof, that's a minus. For correction, that's a minus. For instruction in righteousness, that's a plus. So you got the sandwich, positive, negative, negative, positive. So it's like, you're really a great guy and I like you a lot, but you really messed this up and now you're going to be punished like this, but you're still a great guy and I just want you to know we still love you and we're going to keep you on. Okay, so it's plus, minus, minus, plus. But Paul's approach here is not plus, minus, minus, plus. His approach here is minus, big minus, but don't worry about it because we got some pluses. And it ends on an up note in that sense. So he begins with a gentle rebuke and with a strong message of confidence. And it's the second time in a very short space that Paul tells them to be of good cheer. The first time is in verse 22. Be of good cheer, be of good cheer. Do you not know what's going on here? The ship is sinking. We're going to die. Sharks are going to eat our bodies. And you're saying be of good cheer. He says it twice because he has confidence from God. The fact that he believed in God, the fact that he was God's child gave him a certain level of confidence. And, what is it that will cause our hearts to be of good cheer while we're in the midst of a trial? Well, the fact that we truly believe that God has promised that he's going to be with us and that he's going to bring us through it all one way or the other. Happy in the storm. Doesn't make sense to most people. We're going through all that we're going through, and if somebody says, well, why are you so happy? Well, might not make sense, but that's exactly what the believer can experience if we'll remember the promises of God. What's going to happen in the future? We just went through 2 weeks of not being able to have church because the government said you can't have church. Only 2 weeks. After 2 weeks and we get through the holidays, it'll be okay. Well, guess what? Now they're tacking 2 more weeks on. Okay, 2 more weeks. We can make it just 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks. It'll be all right. How do we know it's going to be all right? We don't know it's going to be all right. So you might as well go ahead and make your decision now that you're just going to be filled with the joy of the Lord through it all, because frankly, we just don't know if it's going to get better or not. And my wife and I were talking this morning about 6:30 this morning, and I was like, no, I don't see an end to this. I don't see it stopping. Once the government figures out how much control they can exert, they'll continue to do so. It's just kind of the way it's always been in the history of man. I don't see that changing. So no, I don't think it's going to get better, but I'm certainly not going to be glum until I reach the age of 200, because that's how long I plan to live. I just want to be, able to serve the Lord and be happy in it. Well, if you're going to be happy in the storm, you have to be able to lean on God's promises. And so this is what Paul's doing. He's trying to get them to do the same thing. They're struggling with that in a major way. Verse 26, he says, howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. Now we know what the island is. Later we learn in the next chapter. They end up in a place called Malta is where they end up. We should be impressed at this because God is all knowing. God says, you're going to live, Paul. You're going to see Caesar. You're going to have a shipwreck. You're going to lose a boat. Everybody's going to live, and you're going to be on an island. Great. Island vacation. Sounds wonderful. Sounds good. Not quite so fast. So, even in the very place that, they're going to be shipwrecked, even that was known in advance. God knew all the details. And, if you know that God knows all the details, you could also say that God plans those details. So it was, did God want them to disobey? No. Did does God want anybody to disobey? No, but he knows that's going to happen, and he works it in. And he's done that in order to bring Paul on his way to see Caesar. Verse 27 says, but when the 14th night was come, 14th night? As Brother Caleb says, when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, I'll come back to that word in a minute, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. There's a storm, there's clouds all over, they can't see a thing, it's pitch black, they don't have high beams on their boat, but it's about midnight, and somehow they figure out they're close to land, all right? They have no idea where this land is because, they don't have the sun, the moon, the stars. They don't have any way of knowing. The ship's being tossed all over the place. They're probably as lost as a white poodle in a snowstorm, and they have no clue what's going on, but they figure out that they're close to land. And it's taken them 14 days, 14 nights to get to this point. 2 weeks of nerve-wracking storm, 2 weeks of fear, 2 weeks of back-breaking labor. Some of that time being back-breaking labor without sustenance. And here they are, about ready to hit land. And they know it's going to be a shipwreck. In the Adria is what we call the Adriatic Sea. And in Paul's day, it was the sea between Greece, Italy, and Africa. And it included the Cilician and Ionian Sea at that time. And if you look at because we know that where they landed, if you look at it, they're not in the Adriatic Gulf, or what we would call the Adriatic Gulf today. They're further south than that, but they're down near Malta because that's where they ultimately ended up landing. So I know you've got the Bible map in your head and you can figure all that out, but that's about where they are. And so they are really not that far from where they all started when they first pulled up their anchor, when the blowing wind was soft and calm. They haven't made much headway. It's been 2 weeks and they've been all over the place, tossed and turned and thrown everything overboard. And now they're not really all that far from where they started. And so verse 28 says that they sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Now, when it says that they sounded, this was kind of an ancient form of sonar, if you will, but it's not actually using sound. What they would do in those days is they'd let down a line with a lead ball or something at the end, and they would measure the depth that way. It would hit the bottom. They say, okay, well, the line is X number of fathoms, and that was called sounding. And in the 1600s, in the 1600s, when the King James was translated, they called it sounding, and so that's what they used in the verse. But the point is that the depth was growing more and more shallow at a very rapid rate, because they sounded, it was 20 fathoms. They'd gone a little further, not much further. Remember, they already know that they're getting close to land, so they're not going full speed ahead, if you will. They go a little further. They sounded again, and then they found it 15 fathoms. So they have lost 5 fathoms of depth. Now, a fathom is about 6 feet. So 20 fathoms would be about 120 feet, and 120 quickly turned to 90. So what does that mean? That means that something under the water is rising quickly under their boat. And that something, of course, is land. And, the funny thing about land is that it never really moves much for boats. And so they know that they're in big trouble. So verse 29 says, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day, which is an interesting statement. They understand that the ship is very quickly heading into very shallow waters. You think of 90 feet of water as being deep if you're in the water swimming yourself. But if you're in a ship, 90 feet of water is not that deep. It's deep enough for a ship to float or sail or whatever, but not when you know that it's getting shallower really fast. And so they drop these 4 anchors off the stern or the aft of the ship. And this they did at night, and they're hoping to hold on until morning. Remember, we found out that, it was around midnight when they realize that, wow, we're gonna hit an island here. We better do something. So they drop their anchors off the back of the boat to try to hold the boat from, cruising on in and crashing on the shore. And so verse 30 is interesting because it says, and as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. There's a couple of places in this verse where you get the feeling that these guys are not really, all on the surface with things. It says they were about to flee out of the ship. In other words, they were running away from the ship. And it says that as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. So these guys, they are literally trying to run away from the ship. They're trying to escape from the ship. And so they're pretending that they're going to go down into the foreship, which was like a smaller boat. And, for us, you could just think a lifeboat kind of thing. And they were just going to go sail out a little bit. And they're saying, we're going to pretend to go out and drop anchors, a little bit further away from the ship to give it some balance there, And so that's what they're pretending to be doing, but that's not really what they're doing. To be close to, and they know this is, something that you should think about. If you're close to a sinking ship, that's bad, because when the ship goes under, it pulls the water like that. And if you're not far enough away, you're going to get sucked under, and chances are you aren't going to live. So if you happen to be on a ship that's going down, swim as far away from that thing as you possibly can before it goes under. You may have a chance there. If you don't, you could get hurt, you could get drowned, maybe even killed by debris. So it's quite sensible then to think like they're thinking. The ship's going to go down. If we're on the ship, we're going to die. So guys, don't tell anybody. Let's all get together. We'll get down to the foreship. We'll pretend we're dropping anchors and we'll go out and just get away from this thing. This is what they're thinking. And so, their real motive was they want to escape. They want to get into a small boat and run away. But notice verse 31. I would love to have been there. I'd love to see how this all happened. It says that Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, you cannot be saved. So I imagine these guys are going, we'll be back in a minute, guys. We're just going to go take this fourth ship and Bill, you go grab a couple of those anchors, and we're just going to go out and we're going to go drop some anchors. And Paul says, hey, centurion, if these guys get out of the boat, that's going to be real trouble. Don't let them get out of the boat, because if they do, you cannot be saved. And so, Paul had earlier told them that there would be no loss for life. But apparently they don't believe that. The actions of these seamen show a very severe lack of faith on their part. And Paul has given the warning before, and his warning came true. And so now the Roman centurions are like, well, we better listen to Paul. So we're going to find out in a minute that they actually wouldn't allow that. But let me just give you this thought. In a sense, this is true of a church under trial or persecution. And it seems like, when a church is having difficulties, there's always those who want to jump ship. And I've always been disturbed by that. If your ship is going through a trial of any type, maybe there's division in the church for whatever reason. It could be any reason. It could be the color of the carpet, or it could be, the treasurer took the money bag and ran off, or whatever the situation is. And you always have those that I say that they have no loyalty to the cause of the church, and they'll look at the situation and go, I ain't sticking around here. I'm getting out of here. And they run away from the sinking ship. They feel like it's sinking. But the reality is, sometimes when people jump ship, they only make it worse. And so that's what's happening here. So in those rare cases where everyone sticks together, the sea didn't get smoother, but the ship makes it. And it's different if you find yourself in the middle of a church where there's preaching of heresy or that sort of thing. I understand that, but often when people leave a church, it has nothing to do with doctrine. I've been around a long time, and it's usually not doctrine. It's usually something else. I'm not so sure that that's the right approach. So verse 32, then the soldiers, what do the soldiers do? The soldiers say, okay, so you guys are going to go get in this little boat here. They pull out their little pocket knives and they cut the ropes and let the boat fall in the water. You're not taking this boat. Clearly, the centurion believes Paul. That's why they cut the ropes and allowed it to fall into the ocean. And at this point, there would be no other way to get off the ship. Either that they were going to somehow make it through the storm, or they were going to go down with the ship, because they're not going to take the foreboat. It's gone now. All right. So Paul had already alluded to the fact that they were going to be shipwrecked. He already said that in verse 10 and verse 22. So, they have to know at this point, okay, well, I guess we're just here with the ship. You know what's really great motivation? If you take away somebody's ability to run away. If you take away their ability to run away, they fight harder. I learned that. My dad, he taught me how to box, and he put me up against a neighbor kid once. I remember when I was a kid and we were boxing. The neighbor kid was bigger and older, and he got me in the corner and dinged the bell. And, it was like supposed to be 3 rounds, because we're kids, you can't go 12. So he pulls me off to the side, and I said, Dad, he got me in the corner. He's bigger and I can't reach him. He says, well, you got nowhere to run. So you can either fight your way out or you can get hit. What do? Then you fight your way out, right? So this is what now these guys are forced into that position of having to do, which of course they don't do. They still go down with the ship, but that's another story. So verse 33, and while the day was coming on, it says, let me see, where am I at? Should I stop here? Maybe I should stop here, because we still got a lot to go before we reach the end of the chapter. So yeah, I think I'll just go ahead and stop here in verse 33, because that leads us up to the next little event in their sailing. So we'll stop here at Acts 27 and verse 33. And I know usually at the end, I'll ask if there are any questions or anything of that nature, but being online, I really can't hear you talking to your computer screen or your iPhone or whatever you're watching on anyway. So if you have any questions about what we covered or any comments about it, please feel free to text me, or, if you want, call me or email me or whatever. And I can talk about those next week. So with that, I'm going to close with a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. God, thank you so much for your word. As we study about being in a ship in the midst of a storm, we find ourselves in life sometimes in the midst of a storm. And we want to be wise. We want to know, Lord, your will, first of all, and then we want to obey it. And so help us to learn from these things. Help us to be not the kind of people that will run away from life's problems, but that we'll face them and allow you to, through your promises, to help us work our ways through them. And we'll thank and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.